You're listening to the Men's Health Foundation podcast. I'm David Watson.
And I'm Marcus Boso.
Men's Health Foundation is a nonprofit healthcare provider for all men, specializing in gay men's health here in Los Angeles.
Each episode, we welcome members of our care team to discuss trending topics in medicine and wellness to help you take charge of your health.
Welcome back to the Men's Health Foundation podcast. I'm David Watson here with
Marcus Boso.
And we have our special guest today with us, and his name is
Brandon Simpson.
Welcome back, Brandon.
Back.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again on the podcast. This topic is something that I'm excited that you came to us with this suggestion, and I can't wait to dive in. I'd love to have you introduce it to us.
Yeah, so today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about sex and porn addiction, which I'm passionate about because that's actually outside of Men's Health Foundation. I treat people who have sex and porn addictions and partners of people who have these addictions. On top of treating people, I'm also certified to do this. I'm a certified sex addiction therapist that I've had to go through rigorous training. I've had to do hours of supervision to make sure that I'm quote unquote qualified to do this, and I have a pretty low certificate hanging up in my office that says I did it.
Okay, very, very legitimate. Then sounds like a very formal process to go through.
It is hours of module training. So I got my training through the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals, so ITAP for short. And they are very rigorous. It is they're based out of Arizona, but everyone from around the world goes to ITAP to be able to get this training. It's 4 modules. Every module is a Wednesday to Sunday training. You have to sit there 8 hours a day. They teach you on different aspects, etiologies, and treatment modalities for not just people who have these addictions or compulsivities, but also the partners. We actually learn how to help partners through this. And at the end of it, we have to get paired up with a clinical supervisor who oversees our caseload. So thankfully, I'm at a clinic who specializes in this. And so my regular clinical supervision counted. So I was able to get through it pretty quick.
Oh,
nice.
Well, congrats.
Thank you.
Yeah. We're in good hands today, everyone.
Yes. So maybe to get us started, I'd like to ask if you could define for us what is sex or porn addiction?
Yeah, so that's actually really interesting because, and I'll preface this for the whole podcast, that there's actually not just one way to define sex addiction, but there's also multiple words for it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's because here in the United States, we don't have a formal mental health diagnosis. So if you go into a mental health office or you're seeing a therapist, you will never see on any of your medical records sex addiction or porn addiction or things like that. Because here in the States, we go off of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. We don't have that definition. So when I'm talking about sex addiction, there's a bunch of different words for it. It's sexual compulsion, hypersexuality, out of control sexual behavior, problematic sexual behavior, or like the ICD-11, which is the International Diagnosing Manual that everyone else but us in the States use. They define it as compulsive sexual behavior disorder. So it is multifaceted, it's multi-worded. But if a patient comes into me and they say, I have a sex addiction or a porn addiction, I really look at how they're using sex or porn to cope with the stresses of their day. If sex is no longer this thing that they do to enhance who they are as a sexual being, it doesn't enhance eroticism or individuality. It doesn't promote positive interactions. That's usually what I look for in people who are quote unquote sex addicts.
Okay, so it does seem similar to the idea of I've heard when it comes to other conversations on addiction, maybe starting with an assessment of the impact that this activity is having on, everything else in their life, the things that they care about, the people they care about, their own well-being. And I wanted to ask, sort of bring that up because I think one of the things that's maybe tricky to get a sense of is how to kind of define that line between a healthy relationship with sex or porn and something that would be considered an addiction.
Yeah, and it really depends on how it's impacting your spheres of functioning, I like to call it. So All of our spheres of functioning is our schooling, if we go to school, our relationships, it's our finances, it's the relationships we build, the interpersonal ones that we have, and how do we cope with our emotions, our emotional well-being. And really with sex and porn, if it's an addiction, what it does is it starts inhibiting those spheres of functioning. You're not being able to build quality relationships, or you're having a hard time building quality relationships. The sex or porn comes first before the relationships. You're spending outrageous amounts of money on porn subscriptions, on OnlyFans, on, if you decide to go to an exotic dance club, you're spending copious amounts of money over there before you're paying for your bills and your rent. It's not fulfilling you after you have a sexual encounter, or you are using porn and masturbating to porn, and you have this shame or guilt at the end of it. There's a maladaptive piece to sex and porn.
For the shame aspect of it, I'm curious, do you think that comes from the actual addiction itself, or do you think it could be, like you said, like multifaceted, like, for example, religious shame, or like other things that come into play?
So specifically for sex and porn addiction, there is a very clear cycle that I usually can map out in my patients or the clients that come to me. If it's more religious shame, so say you have, being gay is the ultimate religious shame for some people. And so if, we've had patients come into my private practice or the group practice that I work at, and they are like, I have a sex addiction. I am doing things that I do not align with, that it doesn't work for me. And we're like, okay, so what's going on? And they're like, well, I like watching gay porn. I'm like, okay, let's go into that a little bit. How often are you watching it? Is it impacting other things? They're like, no, I just don't like that I'm doing it. Okay, well, we usually don't be like, okay, well, you're not an addict. You just have a little bit of shame or internalized homophobia. Let's parse that out.
Okay.
How do we treat that piece of it?
Got you.
Whereas the shame for, traditional people who actually do have this addiction or compulsivity, the shame or the guilt tend to come in is because they can't properly cope with the stresses of their day.
Okay.
It kind of fulfills that self-telling prophecies that they've been told their whole life. They're no good. They're not good enough. They're not man enough to be able to deal with their stresses. And they go to these already taboo things, to talk about sex and porn in any instance is taboo. And now they're going into this taboo world to cope with those stresses.
Okay.
One of the things that I wanted to maybe also establish is talking about sex and porn. When it comes to porn, I'd just be curious, how you would kind of categorize it any differently than sort of physical sexual activity, or just kind of this all different sort of types of experiences people can have that are sexual experiences for them, whether or not they're in person with somebody else.
Yeah, so really sex and porn, they're both the same in that they have the same, they result in the same thing. They're the reason the person goes into those vices almost, it's the same reason. Something is unmanageable in their life. It's work. It's they're not connecting in their relationship. They feel alone. They're lonely. And, what that tends to do is it triggers their belief system. I am unworthy. I am unlovable. The things that my dad told me, I'm not man enough, those are coming into fruition because I can't make these healthy connections. And that's when they start dipping into this addictive cycle. And whether it's porn or sex, it always usually ends up in shame or guilt. And that's the new unmanageability, that kind of, I like to call it the undertow of a wave. Like, if you've ever gotten caught in a wave before, which I have, and it's very scary. Almost died one 4th of July.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my gosh, Brandon.
I got caught. I just happened to get caught. And it what it does is the wave crashes down and it pulls you back into the ocean. And as you're trying to as you're trying to walk up the shore, up through the sand, out of the water, the wave comes back through and pulls you in. So that's the cycle that a lot of my patients are going through, and they're trying to find a way to be able to get out of that.
Yeah, of course. Where do we go from there? The thing that I come back to when you talked about the the incident of the person who just didn't like that they were watching gay porn, for example. It would seem to me that maybe it's the case that for gay men, the relationship or the propensity towards sex and porn addiction is a unique experience for them. Especially you bring up things like shame and feeling like, someone's not good enough, or maybe there's something wrong with them, something like that. Could you tell us a little more about, just for gay men especially, how sex and porn addiction, seems to come up?
Yeah, and I think actually we spoke about this right before we hopped on and started recording, is that it is inherent. It is weaved into our culture as gay men. As I think even it's just the LGBTQ community, like it is weaved in, and it's sometimes really hard to parse out because, we birds of the same feather flock together. So you are forming these social groups with other gay men who maybe have their own shame and guilt and feelings around sex and porn. And, it tends to influence us. I had a patient not too long ago and we were doing the initial assessment or my intake, and he was like, well, I don't know if I have an addiction because all my friends are just telling me that I'm just a horny gay man and I'm just having, the appropriate amount of sex for a gay man. But he's like, I don't get any joy out of it. So he's like, and it's this kind of chasm that a lot of us tend to yell into of like, I don't like this. I don't like what I'm doing. But instead of hearing our echo back, we hear that you're fine. And I mean, there's also social media and all the medias that tend to perpetuate us as a overtly sexualized group.
Absolutely.
What do you think for people who are struggling with that sort of chasm and the sort of rebuttal that this is not actually happening to you and it's this? How do you think people can actually start to manage what they're going through when they struggle with how much they're using porn or the ways that they're using sex? What are some tips?
Yeah, so it is very different for every patient, but usually the very first things that I suggest to a lot of my patients is a period of sobriety. Let's stop the porn use. Let's delete the hookup apps. Let's try to maintain a level of abstinence to see when does the desire to watch porn and sex come up. Let's take away the coping mechanism to see what triggers the coping mechanism, and then let's try to find other things to go in its place so that you can find a more healthy coping mechanism. But it's also boundary work. If you're going to a friend of, I'm having this trouble, and your friend goes, no, you're not, let's put up a boundary and say, I really don't appreciate when I tell you I'm having a problem and you don't believe me. You kind of gaslight me a little bit.
That's great.
How do we navigate, wanting to be sex positive, judgment free, and, understanding or being able to appreciate the ideas of sex and porn addiction?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because that's a very fine line. And I think what we tend to receive as gay men, assuming all of us are gay men, I do apologize.
Yes.
I do apologize.
Correct.
The one thing we get is that the exaggerative sex positivity. People are sometimes so afraid to be considered homophobic, or they're considered not an ally.
Sure.
If you're like, you kind of have a problem.
Right.
Something seems a little off. Hey, you're canceling plans a lot, and you are, and you say you're going to go hook up, or you're putting yourself in dangerous situations where, your safety's at risk. You get tested every 3 months. You're not on PrEP, but you're putting yourself in these situations where you may get HIV, chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis. There's things that you say that your belief system is, but you're going actively against that. How can I help you? Instead of we get the pop off queen, do what you want to do.
Right.
Yeah, but to your point though, I think you had mentioned earlier the idea of it just being something that's a part of the culture that, having relationships or friendships or connections and circles with other gay men who are going through their own, experience with this, to where maybe they may be struggling with this themselves and they may not be in a position to be able to identify it as an issue, or be able to have that kind of be able to offer that kind of support for someone. I can totally see that. I know that a lot of what we focus on here is testing and treatment.
Yeah.
Helping to make sure that people get on PrEP, just to where we're not spreading STIs, that we're trying to end the epidemics as far as HIV transmission, and helping people understand things like U equals U to reduce HIV stigma, keep people with HIV in treatment and care. But this idea of kind of even assessing someone's relationship to sex and porn. And I think in this instance, because we're talking about STIs, maybe especially sex, although I think that I don't want to say two sides of the same coin, but I think a really close connection there, right? It's really interesting to bring up this conversation, because I don't think that I've heard it much when it comes to, content for gay men or conversations that gay men have around sex. So I wanted to ask, what resources are available for folks?
Yeah, so in Los Angeles, we are lucky enough to have a plethora of resources. I think within the LA County area, there are 3 places where you can go that are really headed by really great people. Actually, when I was doing my certificate program, it was 2 out of the 3 were facilitators, and the 3rd biggest one is the one that I work at, but I just knew them by name. So it all depends on where you are. So I know out in Santa Monica, Westwoodish area, a woman by the name of Alexandra Katahakis. She has her own clinic called the Center for Healthy Sex, where they do not just sex and porn addiction, but they do sex therapy for erectile dysfunctions and stuff, and intimacy disorders and things like that. I think up in the valley around the Burbank area, Robert Weiss owns a group practice called Seeking Integrity. And then if you are in the Long Beach area, there is Novus Mindful Life. They're the kind of the triangle in LA County.
Oh, great resources.
Yeah.
And I think that we'd have an opportunity to link to those with this episode. So thank you for mentioning those, for bringing those up. When it comes to someone who has gotten to a place where they're considering this possibility that maybe this is an addiction for them, what are the steps after that? What's the journey look like them for after that, and what could the future look like for them eventually? Yeah.
So really, the journey starts with I like to call when someone does come in and, they do have this compulsive sexual behavior, this compulsivity around sex or this addiction. What it does for the brain is it builds the 10 freeway it builds a 10 freeway of neural pathways. It goes straight from the pleasure center of the brain to where the occipital portion of the brain. So the vision and stuff like that to view porn, or the sensations, wherever it activates in the brain, it creates the Panama Canal pathways. It is a really strong pathway. And what I tell a lot of my patients is this journey is, one, we have to stop the 10 freeway, literally stop it, get everyone off of the freeway, and then we have to destroy the freeway. We have to destroy that big of a freeway. We need to start taking back roads. You need to start driving through the streets. You need to start developing other neural pathways to start reorientating yourself to sex and porn. And I think that's the big thing is, a lot of people come in, they're like, okay, well, I'm never going to be able to have sex or watch porn again. No. We need to start rebuilding that relationship around it. Yeah. And usually we have to stop that relationship for a little bit, build new relationships with a bunch of other things, and then we'll be able to rebuild the freeway or the back roads, so it's not your main source of travel anymore.
I like that. It's that takes a lot of work for sure,
It is. I tell it is not. It can be an easy process. It's not a very short process. I think they say on average, when I was getting my certificate, they say takes 1 to 5 years.
Wow.
Because it's, and you have to also think of who we are as a society. We are a very big sex sells society. sex sells. Sex is in the forefront of the media, especially for us gay men. We are over sexualized in a lot of our representation in media, or we're represented with a very specific light, and it is really hard to walk through and be able to understand how it impacts you. What's the main way how we have to prove that we're gay? We have to have sex with another man.
Yeah.
Your emotional connection to a man, your mental connection to another man is completely invalidated unless you're having sex with another man. Then you are gay.
Right. That's a good point.
If you're not doing that, then your identity is invalidated by everyone.
Yeah.
Even if you go into, I know we're in West Hollywood, if you go down to the Abbey, you go into Rocco's and everything, and you go down there and they're like, oh, let's hook up, and you're like, oh, well, I haven't had sex with a man. They're like, well, are you even gay? Especially it makes me think of like people who identify as bisexual. Their bisexuality is automatically discounted if they haven't had sex with a man.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a good point. And I could imagine that goes the same way for bisexual women as well. That is really interesting. And I also think it's so interesting to think about for gay men too. When I think about men in general, I think there's a sense of, the idea of being able to like brag about your sexual prowess or conquests. And I've perceived that, have a version of that in the gay community as well.
Yeah.
So to your point, I definitely feel like it's kind of like, I don't want to say an uphill battle, but I feel it's definitely like swimming against the current.
It is definitely trying to go against the cultural norm. And every single time you're having to take one step, and then it's 2 steps, and then it's 3 steps up the hill. And it's every single time you somehow have to you get more and more steps every single time. And you look up, you're like, really? I have to try to climb that hill against society? And at the whole time you have people dragging you down. People telling you at the same time, oh, well, that's not how we do things. That's not what it means to be gay. Like, that's not what happens, girl. What are you doing?
Right. Totally.
I wanted to ask you if you feel like with technology, how that may have impacted sex and porn addiction. I mean, I was just talking to Mark earlier, like as millennials, growing up as kids with the internet access at home, I feel like there was this sense of, the internet was always accessible, even for us. I can't imagine for even younger gay men, what their experiences may have been like. And of course, with the advent after social media with like hookup apps, tell us about how that plays into it.
So we've seen like a boom in these types of compulsivities because of the accessibility. Back in the 70s, the 80s, and even the early 90s, the only way you can get porn is if you went to the magazine store, you went to the video store. You had to go you didn't just have to go to the back, but you had to go request it because they put the gay porn under lock.
Wow.
And then so that adds in that shame to it because you have to go above all these barriers to get something that you find arousing or pleasing. And even now with the advent of Pornhub being so accessible through your phone, having hookup apps that say they're what is Grindr's slogan is like, we're trying to make connections. Girl, we know you're making one kind of connection. And things like that. And even then that starts blurring the lines. The only way you make a connection is if you're having hookups. It is at your fingertips, right. and even then the way we have sex is so quick. It's just not meant for pleasure. It's meant just as a release. And even then some of the cruising spots and stuff like that our communities tend to gravitate towards, they're in dark alleys. They're not meant for the light. They're not meant to be seen or celebrated or kind of explored. Where voyeurism and stuff like that, if done safely and in the consciousness of the public, can be something that turns people on. But we get pushed out to the back, into the alleys, into the random pieces of buildings, to the dark corner of the bathhouse and stuff like that. Or the unsolicited brick building where you have no idea what's going on, but it looks like it's locked up. But you see people walking in and out.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I mean, all of these things.
Yeah.
It's just a testament to that level of sex positivity where at least there's a sense of access to help, and that it seems as if, at least if this is something that we can talk about and feel less shame around, that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and it's starting to build, I think it's that there sometimes is this notion that even if I don't want to do it, I should. And so it's, even for some of those patients, okay, well, if you don't want to, how do we listen to that part of you? How do you voice it and set that boundary of like, no, that's not what I want, so I'm not going to participate.
Right.
Because you want it.
Good point. So I think we've already maybe touched on the idea of there were certain populations more vulnerable to sex and porn addiction, or if it's a widespread condition, or do you feel like there's more to unpack there?
So actually, it's really interesting. So when we see the statistics around sex and porn addiction, there's actually a disparity. I think I read a book about a Robert Weiss, and it's called Cruise Control. It talks about sex and porn addiction within the gay male community. It was published early 2000s, so I think the statistic has definitely changed. But I think he mentioned in the book that the statistic for heterosexual people, it's only 3 to 5% of their population is considered to have a sex or porn addiction. Whereas for gay and bisexual men, that percentage actually jumps to 10%.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So the 10% of the population is not expected to, but is predicted to have this very specific relationship to sex and porn.
More than double.
Yeah.
I know.
It's a great title, by the way, for the book.
Yeah, it's a really great read.
We'll have to link all of these resources after the episode. And I wanted to ask too, intersections present between sex and porn addiction and other addictive behaviors or substances.
Yeah, so actually it's really interesting. So when I was trained to teach sex, not to teach, but to treat sex and porn addicts, we've separated them. We are able to separate them into 2 different categories. So more of a classical sex addict or more of a contemporary sex addict. More of the classic are some more of the older generations. They are the ones who didn't have the advent of internet. They didn't grow up with smartphones. They were able to utilize it when they needed it, but their addiction didn't really start out with the internet.
Right.
Whereas contemporary sex addicts really had that internet. They had, unique, intense, and always novel content at the at their fingertips. So, what we're starting to see now is, yes, a lot of younger people are coming in with this very specific relationship to sex or porn, but we're also seeing, anxieties. We're seeing depressions. We're seeing a lot of co-occurring disorders or cross addictions also. So on top of, sex or porn, there is hypopper use. There is alcohol that's always involved with it. There's other substances, and it then pushes them to do things that they normally wouldn't do sober or off of the influence of these substances.
Wow.
That makes a lot of sense. For folks that are close to someone that they would perceive may be experiencing sex or porn addiction, what advice would you have for those folks?
I always tell my patients, find an accountability buddy.
Okay.
Find someone who you trust in. Even one of my patients taught me this, and I had to listen to the podcast that they listened to, because in the podcast, it says the opposite of addiction is connection.
Wow.
Addictions tend to isolate us, tend to pull us away from those social connections, and to actively go against that addiction is to pull into those healthy social relationships that you have. Find that friend that you love to kiki with. Let them know what you're going through. Be honest with them. And what they'll do is they'll keep you accountable. Hey, are you really canceling plans because you're feeling stressed, or you really have other things to do, or are you trying to blow me off because of this, XYZ? Hey, how about, or it's even some place if a patient or a person is struggling, they're like, I feel really triggered. I don't want to go on the apps. I don't want to log into my watch OnlyFans and stuff like that. They can always reach out to that person. Hey, can you help me get out of my house? Help me change my environment so I can change my state of mind. And so it's always finding that one person and always being an ally and, being a support to the person who is going through these very unique relationships with sex and porn.
I like that. I like the practical tips, and especially like scripts for people who might know someone who's struggling with it, and maybe they don't know how to exactly bring it up to their friend because, again, they don't want to offend anyone or cross the line in any way. So I think that's something good for friends of people,
Yeah, who's going to serve a better cup of tea than our good Judies?
Right.
They're going to tell us exactly what's going on
Right.
than that one person who we know that we really trust.
Right. Yeah.
How about relationships? If someone is in a relationship with someone who is experiencing sex or porn addiction?
Yeah, so it's really interesting when I am helping a couple and one person does have this addiction or this compulsivity and it doesn't align with their partner's view of the relationship, I usually tell them both to do individual therapy. Because what tends to happen is that, a 10, 15, 20-year relationship, that one person's had the addiction the entire time and the partner has never known about it because the person has been so good at hiding it from their own shame. Their shame has told them to hide it, that they shouldn't be doing that this is not right, but that shame kind of perpetuates them into it. Right. So with couples, what I tend to do is we start rebuilding that relational foundation. The one partner, the betrayed partner, you go into therapy, start working on your non-negotiables in the relationship. What will not fly in the relationship, what your expectations of that relationship is. The person who has this unique addiction to or relationship to sex and porn, you go do therapy, go to see an individual therapist because they're going to help you become sober. If this is something that you don't want to do, they're going to help you do that. They're going to help you incorporate your partner's non-negotiables and expectations of this relationship into your treatment. And then we come together and we see how they've come together as a couple is usually what I tend to do.
That's great. So,
and then for patients who have open relationships, I usually tell them to shut it down. Let's close the relationship for a little bit. Let's just be monogamous. Doesn't mean you guys cannot open the relationship again. But for, 90 days, 6 months, let's do it for the year. Just close it down. Do not give the opportunity to act out, to go seek extracurricular connections or anything like that. And we can talk about opening it back up later and what the parameters and the rules are to that relationship so that we can all be acting within our authenticity and integrity.
Amazing. As we wrap up, are there any take-home messages that you want to leave the viewers with?
The key message is you're not alone, that unique experience, we all have unique experiences to sex and porn. Your own unique experience, it doesn't define who you are, and it is something that you can work on and rebuild. It doesn't define who you are.
Great advice.
Yeah. Let's end on that. That's a good closer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. We'd love to have you back. I think this was a really great topic. And I did want to, of course, mention you're a specialist in this and you are a behavioral health specialist here at Men's Health Foundation.
Yes.
And are you available currently for new patients?
I am currently available for new patients. If you're interested in getting an initial assessment or intake, feel free to give us a call. We'll have our call center assess your insurance and stuff like that to see what financial obligations you will have or not have, and then you'll be able to make a decision off of that.
Great. Thank you so much, Brandon.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
We'll see you next time.
Yes.
Thank you.
Same.
Yeah.